Bloomberg has learned that the U.S. Treasury Department is planning to toughen its stance to protect U.S. intellectual property against China in a move that could heighten an already heated trade dispute. Under the new plan, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin would move to limit Chinese tech investments in the U.S. under the guise of national security concerns. China's Ministry of Commerce didn't respond to Bloomberg's inquiry about this report, but Secretary Mnuchin took to Twitter to dispute it, saying on behalf of Donald Trump, the stories on investment restrictions in Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal are false, fake news. The leaker either doesn't exist or know the subject very well. Statement will be out, not specific to China, but to all countries that are trying to steal our technology. Joining us now from New York to discuss, Isaac Stone Fish, a senior fellow at the Asia Society, and with me in studio, Bloomberg Tech senior executive editor Brad Stone. Isaac, I want to start with you. Reading between the lines or the tweets, what's your read on this?
It does seem like there is a there. Mnuchin seems like he got caught off guard by that Sunday Wall Street Journal story that talked a lot about this, and it does seem to reflect in a way a fight within the administration between trade hawks like Navarro and Mnuchin, who wants to have a more balanced strategy towards China.
We're seeing, Brad, U.S. stocks getting dragged down with this. What's the impact on U.S. tech companies?
I mean, there's a lot of fear out there. You look today, NVIDIA down 5%, Micron down 6%, Intel 3.5%. China is the biggest tech market in the world, right? And they haven't had a lot of success in some sectors like semiconductors. You limit the ability of the U.S. tech companies to go and sell into China, and then suddenly you're putting a lot of pressure on China to go and compete. It's also, we all know this is a very global supply chain. A chip gets made in the U.S., it goes to China, gets completed, it gets put on a smartphone, it comes back here. There's a worry that there's not a lot of nuance in this policy, and it ends up hurting a lot of these companies that are very globalized.
Now, Isaac, there's already been an impact on Chinese investment in U.S. tech companies. What has been the impact so far, given the last several months of this sort of tit-for-tat back and forth, and what could the impact of this now be?
So we've seen, in terms of Chinese investment in general, a roughly 90% drop from the first 5 months of this year compared to last year. That's a huge difference in 2018 versus 2017. And while tech companies haven't been the hardest hit, they've certainly faced a lot more difficulty both in getting a comfortable reception in Silicon Valley and in Beijing as well. And in terms of this latest policy, I think what was really interesting was that on Thursday, Chinese Chairman Xi Jinping met with a group of business executives and said, hey, in the West, you guys have this tradition of turning the other cheek. But in China, in my culture, we punch back. And that was before the news broke on Sunday about this even tougher reception that Chinese firms can expect to face, Chinese tech firms especially can expect to face in the United States. So I think this is going to get worse.
And Isaac, you were just on the show a few days ago talking about Google's big investment in JD.com, the big Chinese e-commerce company. Are we not going to see more deals like that?
Now that, I don't want to say that's the end of an era, but I will say that was probably the last bright spot that we might see for weeks, months, or even the rest of 2018 in terms of U.S. and China tech companies cooperating.
How is, Brad, U.S. tech reacting?
They're trying to do everything they can to make an impact on this policy. So the New York Times recently reported that Tim Cook last month was in the Oval Office asking for a more nuanced approach. You've got all the U.S. trade associations going in there and lobbying for changes to this policy. You know, I think they're doing what they can. Is
the U.S. administration going to listen? I mean, is Trump open to this?
We'll see. You know, they haven't. I don't think, you know, we've seen a lot of economic actions couched in national security terms, and I don't think they've shown a lot of flexibility so far.
Isaac, do you get the sense that the president is actually concerned about a trade deficit, or is he concerned about national security? Or playing to his base?
I think he started this out of concern for a trade deficit. He complained in the 80s a lot about the trade deficit with Japan. It's one of his policies he's been surprisingly consistent on for decades. I think a lot of people around Trump have a real fear that Chinese investment brings national security concerns, especially with companies like Huawei and ZTE, major telecommunications companies. And I think the people in the administration are getting Trump to diversify, so to speak, away from just focusing on a trade deficit and focusing on national security implications.
Now, there are many who say this is not a trade war yet. This is just a dispute. You know, certainly there may be more levers to pull. You know, how many more levers are there before we do escalate to code red or whatever you want to call it?
I mean, I think both sides have a lot of different tools that they can use for this. I mean, the two economies are so deeply integrated. And China, for example, there's a lot of major American brands that really see China as their future. I wrote a piece a few months ago about Starbucks and Starbucks' great presence in China and the fear and the possibility that Chinese consumers, perhaps from urging from the government, decide to boycott Starbucks, for example. So there's a lot that Beijing can do to make it more difficult for American companies to flourish in China. And when that happens, and if you have, say, China really pushing against some tech CEOs like we saw with Apple, they are going to go to the White House and they're going to lobby, and they're going to lobby on Beijing's behalf to a degree because they want tensions to subside.